Today we're talking about class. That is right, social class in the Regency era. We're going to be answering this question of whether Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy were really of the same social class. And also we're just going to be examining how class affected society at the time and also in particular marriage. So if you want to learn more about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and classic literature. And if you want to learn more about either of those topics, then definitely subscribe. Also, this is not important to the video, but look at the sleeves on this shirt. They're like bell bottoms, but sleeves. Anyway, I'm just very excited about that, but again, not relevant to Jane Austen's class system. So what I want to do in this video is help us to understand how the people in the Regency understood the class system, because it was very different from what we have today. Obviously, we still have rich people, we have poor people, we have snobby people, but the way we view them is nothing like how they viewed it back then. And to understand Jane Austen's works, we would have to understand the way they looked at the world. Editing Ellie here, wanting to add in an important note on what I'm talking about in this video. So I'm really trying to simplify down the social hierarchy into how it actually functioned in everyday life. You know, the different minute details of the hierarchy are actually different depending on which source you look at, because trying to pin down how social class functioned in a bygone era in minute detail is incredibly hard. And there are so many different factors that come into play for each individual person, like I talk about in my video on how to be a gentleman or lady in Jane Austen's time. So if you haven't seen that video, definitely go check that out. So what I'm trying to do in this video is really try to capture the way that social class functioned in actual life. Because of course, social class wasn't just a hierarchical list that was in some book somewhere. It was an evolving living system that people actually lived their entire lives inside. So really what we're doing is examining how the people in the Regency saw themselves. What was the circle of people they belonged to? Who would they marry? Who would they associate with? And likewise, who would they not marry? Who do they think belongs to a very different circle or sphere than themselves? So that's what we're really examining here, the social crowd that they felt like they belonged to and made decisions in their lives based off of. And this is opposed to me trying to nail down some exact hierarchy that wouldn't have necessarily been representative of how their lives actually worked. And so to get this conversation started off, let's take a look at what Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Elizabeth Bennet have to tell us about class in that famous conversation when they're talking about whether Elizabeth should marry Darcy or not. Lady Catherine says, "But it must not, shall not be. If you were sensible of your own good, you would not wish to quit the sphere in which you have been brought up." And Elizabeth retorts, "In marrying your nephew, I should not consider myself as quitting that sphere. He is a gentleman, I am a gentleman's daughter. So far we are equal." So I already talked a little bit about this quote in my video on why Mr. Darcy is not a lord, but I want to draw attention to the fact that both Lady Catherine and Elizabeth use the word sphere. And this is actually significant because they're talking about social class. You could think of social class as a sphere of society that you're born into. And one of the most important things to remember about the spheres during this time period is that they were seen as created and ordained by God. So the social hierarchy they thought was literally God made. And if you were born poor, well, God made you to be poor. If you were born super rich, that was God's plan for you. And so I've actually been asked before if Jane Austen and the people back then felt bad for the poor people, like, "Oh, you're poor, that's so sad." Or even more specifically, if they felt bad for their servants having to be servants. And I think what we have to remember is rich people felt bad for certain deprivations like starvation, being cold, of the poor. This is why we see them engaged in a lot of charities. Jane Austen herself, of course, was always sewing blankets and baby clothes for poor families. But at the same time, them being poor or them being servants was seen as their place in society. So what people felt pity for was the fact that they were suffering in certain aspects because they were poor, not because they were poor. It's like that is their place in society, and it was viewed as the poor's job to accept that and to try to be the best poor person they could. Accept the fact that God made you a servant, and now you should be the best servant you can be and just embrace that aspect of your life. And which is also why sometimes when people would try to help poor people, say through education, teaching them to read, members of society would look at that and say, you are messing with the system God established. God meant them to be illiterate laborers, and now you're trying to teach them to read. What are you doing? And I think this is even more interesting in that even the reformers who would set up these Sunday schools to try to teach the local poor to read, what they would not do specifically is teach them how to write, because they thought that that would be going too far. You can know how to read, but you can't know how to write, because that is not within your social class. Another reason they didn't want to teach them how to write was because then they thought they might write political tracts promoting the overthrow of the social hierarchy, which was seen as a horrible idea, obviously, by everyone above them on the social hierarchy. And I think this also goes into this idea of upward mobility, or actually the near total lack of it. I can talk from the American perspective here, which is that since we're young, we're always taught like the American dream is even if you're born the poorest person in the world, you could become super rich and even become the president if you want. You know, there's this complete opportunity of social mobility. However, during this time period, that would have been seen as insane and also kind of blasphemous. It's like, you mean you're going to take the poor people out of the place where God put them? That's not acceptable. Which then goes to this question of like upward mobility at all. And what we see is intersphere mobility. And what I mean by that is, think of a sphere as quite a big place. So for example, the top sphere of society, below the king, of course, because the king was number one, the top sphere included the nobility and the landed gentry, and usually it also included members of the clergy, and also the officers of the Navy and Army were usually pretty well mixed in there. Because again, like I talk about in my video on what is the aristocracy, the Navy and the clergy and certain forms of the law were acceptable professions for younger sons of these families at the top of society to have. And so that's the sphere at the top of society. Now, obviously, within that sphere, you have a range, both in income, in levels of status. So for example, a duke is higher than an earl, but an earl is way higher than a small landed country gentleman who only has a small amount of acreage and not that much income. Yet at the same time, they're all within this larger sphere at the top of society. So of course, then we could have some intersphere mobility. So for example, the daughter of a country gentleman could marry an earl, and she would still be within her own social sphere. Would she be at a much higher level of that sphere? Yes. And that's where that mobility comes in, but she's not leaving the sphere in which she was born. Which, when we're talking about moving up and down the class scale, we do see that if you are in the upper class, that's what you're born into. Even if you financially come down, you're still viewed as being in that class. It's very much a what you are by birth and slightly by what you are by marriage. But a great example of this is, of course, Miss Bates in Emma. She used to be richer, but she is of this upper class. So when she becomes poorer, she's still viewed by members of that class as being one of their own. That is why she's visited by Emma. So while there was definitely social mobility up within your sphere, there was also social mobility down within your sphere, but you still remained within the same sphere. And the same thing we see even within poor people. There were the extra poor people, the medium poor people, the just kind of poor people. And within that, there was upward mobility. So for example, if you were born the daughter of a farm laborer, but you were able to become a housemaid for a grand family at the time, that was moving up the poor people's social scale. You were having intersphere mobility there. So the type of social mobility that absolutely was looked down upon was the movement from one sphere into a completely different sphere. So for example, while the daughter of a country gentleman could marry an earl, if the earl went and married his dairymaid, wow, that meant he had to go far out of his sphere, because of course there was like the intermediate spheres of those in trade and stuff in between these two. He would have to skip over several spheres to marry her, which would have been met with complete social ostracism of his new wife and shock, condemnation on many levels. Now, of course, then let's talk about Pride and Prejudice, because I think one of the things people tend to see when they look at the Darcy-Elizabeth relationship is the fact that she is relatively poor and he's super rich. Now, is Elizabeth actually poor? Well, her family's not. She does not come from the poor class by any means of the word. Elizabeth isn't actually poor. The actual main financial problem with Elizabeth is the fact that her father did not save her a good dowry. At his income level, if he had been consistent and thoughtful, he could have. If you want to learn more about dowries, I do have a video on that topic titled Why Are Bennet's Sisters So Poor? Because within their own class, their fortune that they could bring to marriage, which would then get guys to marry them, was quite small. But basically the answer is that Elizabeth and Darcy were of the same social class. He was a landed gentleman, she was a gentleman's daughter. They really were equal when it came to that level of the social class. Like I talk about in my video on why Mr. Darcy isn't a lord, that would have been broken on social standing if he was a lord, but they still would have been of the same overall class sphere, the class sphere that it was okay to move up and down within. They wouldn't have had to cross any sort of major barrier or line to make their relationship happen, even if he was a lord. But this is where I think it's actually very interesting though, because within the story, if you don't know anything about Regency economics or the social system at the time, it could come across very much like, oh, Lizzie's poor and Darcy's super rich. It's like this rags to riches story, this Cinderella moment. And obviously she wasn't in rags, but like this relative Cinderella moment happening to Elizabeth, when in reality she's just marrying someone of her own class. And what is really fascinating to me about this is if we look at Cinderella, the story itself, Cinderella as a story is across so many eras and so many cultures and so many different forms. But the version that would have been popular in England during this era would have been the one put out in the late 1600s by a guy named Charles Perrault. And in fact, that version of Cinderella, as it was laid out by Charles Perrault, is incredibly similar to the Disney version. There is the fairy godmother, there are the mice becoming horses, there's the pumpkin that becomes a carriage, there's the glass slippers that she tries on. A lot of like the gruesome details of classic Cinderella were added by the Grimm brothers, but that wouldn't have happened until the early 1800s. So the story as the Georgian and most of the Regency era would have known it would have been this version from Perrault. Anyway, the reason this is important about Cinderella is because, again, it seems like one of those rags to riches stories. But really, if we look at the main character of Cinderella, she's a poor rich girl. In fact, she's not even a poor rich girl. She's a rich girl being treated badly, but the class that she was born in was still the upper class of society. So here we have Cinderella having downward mobility within her own sphere. She was born into a wealthy, fashionable family, according to this version of Cinderella, and she was just being treated poorly like a servant. But the most important aspect of that is she's not a servant. She was not born into that class. She is inherently, from her birth, still of the upper class, which of course makes her of the proper class to be marrying a prince, which I think is so important to note about Cinderella, is that the social class spheres were not broken by her marriage. because again, she was of the proper class. Now, had the prince went and actually married a girl who was born poor, married in the poorest sphere, that would have been shocking and a totally different story according to how the people at the time understood their world. But that's not what happened. And I think it's the same thing with Elizabeth marrying Darcy. Yeah, her family is not as wealthy as his. She doesn't have that great of a fortune, but him marrying her was still well within the class. We consistently see class lines upheld throughout Jane Austen's works. With Elizabeth, we have a gentleman's daughter marrying a gentleman. In Northanger Abbey, we have a clergyman's daughter marrying a clergyman. In Emma, we have a gentleman's daughter marrying a gentleman again. Same thing in Sense and Sensibility, gentleman's daughter marrying Colonel Brandon, a landed gentleman. And just to really draw attention to this, Emma Woodhouse doesn't go marry a coal miner. Mr. Darcy doesn't go and marry a barmaid. Those would have been completely shocking social hierarchy breaking marriages that we just don't see happening. So I guess I'm just trying to say is the class system remains very well intact throughout Jane Austen's novels. Anyway, I hope this helps you understand how class worked in Pride and Prejudice and the Regency era in general. Also, you might be wondering, okay, so you can only move up within your own sphere, but did anyone ever actually make it into a different sphere? Did they succeed in social mobility? And the answer is yes, but it had certain requirements, and I'm going to cover that in a separate video, so definitely subscribe if you want to see that. Anyway, my name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and 17th century versions of Cinderella, apparently. So subscribe if you like either of those things. And I hope you keep having an awesome day, because you're awesome. Bye! I gotta get my sleeves up so my bye is more dramatic. Bye!